Hello everyone. Now we are going, our group going to presentate our presentation about change. Next. Next. Uh, Most linguistics have maintained that change itself cannot be observed. All that we can possibly hope to observe are the consequences of change. Linguistics have attached little or not theoretical importance to variation. Only in recent decades have some of them seen in it a possible key to understanding how language changes. The traditional view. In the traditional view, the language change. The only change that are important in language are those that cannot be demonstrated to have structural consequences. Over a period of time, a distinction between two sounds may be lost in a language, as occurred historically in most varieties of English in the vowels of meat and of meat or horse. In almost dialects, these vowels have fallen together or coalesced. Alternatively, a distinction may be gained where there was none before, as in a house with an S, but to house with a Z. Or finally, in tin and ting, the N and ng. In each those cases, a single phonological unit became two. There was a structural split, so we can find instances of phonemic coalescence, situation in which contrast existed at one time but later was lost, and it says instances of phonemic split, situation in which there was no contrast at one time but a contrast developed. Variation is either controlled by circumstances or free, random. Internal change in a language is observed through its consequences. It is possible, therefore, to write internal histories of language, showing the structural changes that have occurred over time through use of the principle of contrast versus lack of contrast internal change. Of course, it's not restricted to phonology. The morphology and connotation of language change in the same way. Next. A second kind of change in language is external in nature. This is change brought about through borrowing. Uh, change that occur through borrowing from other dialects or language are often quite clearly distinguishable for a while, at least from change that come about internally. They may be somewhat idiosyncratic in their characteristic uh, or distribution on appear. For a while, at least, to be quite marked in this way. For example, the sh and shm, beginnings of shields and smart or jin, with the J pronounced like Z, Jin, Jin. There are often good social or cultural reason for borrowing, and the items that are borrowed are usually word used to describe exotic objects. For example, pajamas, tea, perfume, and kangaroo, or learn, learn, or scientific word. English Speakers borrow almost indiscriminately from other languages, but speakers of French, German, Modern, Hebrew, and Icelandic are far more discriminating. Speaker of Hindi cultivate once at least at look to Sanskrit for borrowings, and speaker of Urdu look to Arabic as well. See in the following section. There is also some borrowing or spread, at least of phonological and grammatical items through certain area. But this phenomenon is much more limited and undoubtedly much harder to explain than the borrowing of words to describe objects. Of these two kind of change, internal and external linguistic, view uh, view the former or as being far more important, even though it is the latter that is inclined to come to public attention as when efforts are made in purify language. People tend to react to consequences of external change by complaining about failing language standards, resisting new usage and trying to constrain variation. The traditional linguistic approach to change has not been very helpful when controversies have arisen. The traditional view of language change also favors a family tree account of change and of the relationships among language. The alternative, sorry, the alternative wave account of change and relationship is much less easy to work with. In this approach, the various changes that occur must be seen as flowing into and interacting with one another. It is not at all easy to reconcile the need to find contrast with the desire to maintain a certain fluidity in boundaries. Next.
So next will be presented by me, change in progress. Before discussing change in language, we must know that the differences between variation and change, because not all variation is a sign of or leads to change. There is what Labov 2001 P85 calls long-term stable variation. Example, the distribution of the the, and the variables previously discussed, and such alternative as the as alternation. The latter as old as the language. Schools sometimes devote considerable time and effort, very often with, in attempt to eradicate non-standard variant of stable variables. Socioeconomic class, age, and gender in that order appear to be the factors that affect the distribution of these variables, and they continue to operate over long periods of time. Du Bois and Horvath, 1999, p. 298, warned that their work among Cajuns in Louisiana shows that a set of variables cannot be prejudged to be stable sociolinguistic variables because they happen to be stable in in the English language as a whole, or even in surrounding dialect, or even in a surrounding dialects. So what appears to be an instance of a stable linguistic variable might actually be a local innovation. Next, we have change has a direction, being both progressive and linear. For example, the Greek vowel shift in English took centuries and is still incomplete. And the Northern City shift and or NCS in the United States has last several generations and show no sign of weakening. This last change is a vowel change found in cities settled in a westward movement of people from New York State and centered in places such as Buffalo, Detroit, Chicago, and spreading to smaller urban centers. So in this page, a major part of involve a change shift in poles apparently set in motion by the rising of the vowel in words like bag to resemble the vowel in bag. This bag resembles vowel bag. The vowel heart fronts to resemble the vowel in cut, lower to resemble the vowel in cut. The problem, therefore, is one of identifying changes that are occurring and then of trying to account for them. What sets them in motion, how they spread, and how they are maintained. So next, various linguists have observed and reported on what they consider to be change in progress. For example, Chambers and Threadgill, 1998 pp. 170 stripe 5 describe the spread of ovular R in Western and Northern Europe. All the language of this part of the world once had either an apical example tongue tip, trill or flap R, but from the 17th century on a uvular R spread from Paris to replace these other varieties. This new R crossed language boundaries so that it is now standard in French, German, and Danish, and is also found in many varieties of Dutch, Swedish, and Norwegian. It did not cross the channel into England, nor has it penetrated into Spain or Italy. Another phonetician, Jimson, 1962 pp. 83 stripe 5 observed that in mid-20th century received pronunciation or RP. He found such pronunciation mainly among the younger member of fairly exclusive upper-class social groups, but they also appear in less exclusive varieties of RP. Example in the variety favored by BBC announcers of that era. Numerous observed of late 20th century speech in England, see particularly Folk and Docherty 1999 and 2000, have pointed out the spread of such pronunciation as doing of fordering have pointed out the spread of such pronunciations as doing for drink, better for better, bapa for brother, and happy for happy. Such pronunciation apparently originated in Southeast England among younger non-RP speakers, but are now found in most urban areas and across a wide spectrum of social groups. The strong internal links in the uvular area are those between cities, which from a kind of network, apparently uvular are spread from city to city and later into the countryside surrounding each city. But as well as we will see, age differences of this kind might be quite misleading. We must be sure that something we view as linguistic change because older people say one thing and younger people say something else is not just the phenomenon of age grading, of using speech appropriate to your age group. Next.
So the next is me. You can see this table. It's 1 degree of centralization of A and of a y and a w or L by X level on Martha Finerit. This table 8.1. This table shows that centralization is most abused in the 31 to 45 acres. The change was also little more advanced in those of Yankee descent. The among those in the other two groups will which level was concerned, but not by much. It was more advanced among those who made a living from fishing, this among those who worked in camping and business serving the summary visitor. So the next. Sorry, the next one.
Maaf, agak lemot sebentar ya.
Okay, the next, the explanation that level offers is that the change is simply an aggregation of the increasing tendency to concentrate. The first part of the diphthong, informants into three groups according to their feeling about the island: positive, negative, and neutral. Staying on Martha's vineyard and show the commitment by agreeing centralization, even to the extent of pushing centralizing in a way to sur- surpass that in a uh, sorry a way. Harry can quite clearly see the social motivation of a source change. In this case, the change is unmotivated by a desire to show loyalty to particular pledge and solidarity with the people who live there. Black and Jersey, 2003, the Labo study. 40 years later, and in doing so, took into account recent methodological and theoretical development, but costing and social they have been incorporated into sociophonetic studies. In this case, a local poker game in New York, consisting of a small endangered group of men who meet twice a week to play poker, project their Iceland identity by employing large symbolic chose socks as holiday for high tide. Word like doing better outside and more much to know an expression like she was of finishing. So the next one goal of Labo's work one on the R variable in the speech of New York City was to achieve some understanding of social change there. Labo 1994 and the 98 to 86 to 94 tell in how in 1986 forward reflect reflected. Labo Erler study in three stories equality substituting makes for as Kalin since as Kalin had gone out of business. Forward's threat study revealed the certification of the R variable was stable. Labo concludes that under the pressure of the new or pronouncing norms, New York City speech is changed slowly. Labo had expected the Sox hypercorrect behavior would hasten the process of zone change. New York City recently is the four variation reason R pronunciation in words like form and core has become prestigious or alternatively that pronunciation of such word without the R has becomes stigmatized. Sartgill devoted a considerable part of his research effort to investigating world-class speech and what he calls the high value associated with non-standard speech, which may be particularly important in explaining this significance of linguistic variable. So the next.
Okay, next. In Norwegian, it is non-standard usage to stress Sloan words on the first syllable rather than on the last. For example, to use Evis rather than Evis newspaper. This use of stress is associated with lower class behavior. Trudgill notes an interesting case which, on the surface at least, goes counter to the principle that in a social setting of the kind exemplified by Norwich, women generally lead the way in changes toward the standard and then to march in the 88 reports on a follow-up in 1983 of his earlier study, The Variation in Norwich. He replicated his original study as far as he could with 17 additional informants born between 1958 and 1973, and therefore aged between 10 and 25 in 1983. Trudgill also reports that only children born in Norwich with parents who were also born in Norwich produce a particular local distinction between the vowels of moan and moan. This learning constraint is extremely difficult to explain. Young people are sometimes found to speak somewhat differently from their parents and the surrounding community. Okay, next. Williams and Kerswill in 1999. For example, investigated the speech of preadolescent children in Milton Keynes, a fast-growing new town in England within easy reach of London, Oxford, Cambridge, Coventry, and Leicester. Children born in Milton Keynes speak neither like their parents nor like people from the surrounding area. Their speech provides strong evidence for dialect leveling as they produce distinctive local forms that tend towards standard pronunciation, but at the same time show the influence of the fairly widespread youth culture of Southeast England. Cheshire in 1970, finding in reading in non-standard syntax, then lower girl may be motivated by a desire for identity and solidarity. The tougher the boy, the more non his use of the s ending on verbs in the present tense. Bordy 1991 says that linguistic utterances or expressions are always produced in particular forms or markets, and the properties market endow linguistic product with value. The linguistic to how language is used in the give and the social interaction. Next. Labov makes an interesting observation about the role that women play in linguistic change. He points out that whenever there is stratification by style and class in linguistic usage, you can also expect differences between women showing higher values for preferred parents men, that is a preference sorry, I have a bad signal. What we have seen in all of the above studies are attempts made to isolate the kinds of change that appear to be occurring in specific place. These motivations can be various: to try to be like higher social group or less like a lower one, to mark yourself off from outsiders, to achieve a feeling of solidarity with others, or to react to the pressures of the linguistic marketplace. Next. Akan dibacakan oleh Rahayu.
Population decreased as to about a quarter of the total, and many of these, at least until newly, were peasant farmers. German has become the language of social occasion and social status, and it is the young women from the bilingual community who have shown most willingness to participate in social change. Hungarian is symbolic of peasant status, and most young people do not want to be peasants. Young bilinguals want to pass a monolingual Germans and children of mixed marriage in the case and speak parents do not learn to speak Hungarian in upward shows that Hungarian is most likely to be used by older people in networks involving many peasants contracts. German is not used in more situations in which Hungarian was once used, and it is also used more and more even by older bilinguals. But young women with similar strong vision network use German even within these networks. Next. Okay, they reject the use of Hungarian, for it is a clear indicator of peasant status in the community. Young peasant women also prefer not to marry peasant men. They prefer non-peasant German-speaking workers as spouses, but the effect of this is to force the bilingual peasant men also to marry German-speaking peasant women from neighbor village. Use of German alone seems to offer that is hastening the change from bilingualism to monolingualism in the community. Consequently, local men cannot find women in the village to marry and must look for Castilian-speaking wives. The above studies are attempts made to isolate the kinds of changes that appear to be occurring in specific places. These motivations can be various to try to be like your social groups or like a lower one to mark yourself off from outsiders to achieve a feeling of solidarity with others or to react to the pressures of the linguistic marketplace. Also, they are usually in the vanguard of more changes in some is the not so young Juliet. Next. Okay, this is table X.5 difference between men's and UMC. UMC is upper working class. LMC is lower middle class. UWC is upper working class, and LWC is lower middle class. Okay, percentage of multiple negation in Detroit speech. In UNC, male is 6.3, female 0.0, LMC is 32.4 to male, and female is 1.4. UWC, male is 40.0 and female 35.6. LWC, male is 90.1 and female 58.9. Percentage of non-privileged in Detroit Negro speech, male UMC 6.7 and female 90.0 and LMC for male 52.5 and female 70.0, WC male 20.0 and female 44.2, LVC 25.40 male and female 31.7. Percentage of informed in Norwich speech. Male for UMC 4, for LMC 27, and UVC is 18.1 and LVC is 100. To female, UMC is 0 and LMC is 3, UVC is 68 and LVC is 19.7. Next. Next, Manda. Okay, this is the table from figure 80.2. So he was able to plot this use in 1918 to 6. To the left of the vertical broken line by year of birth for informants, there is an almost completely linear decrease in such use from older speakers to younger ones. But it is the last age-graded. Hibbia also had recordings made 30 to 40 years earlier of speakers aged between 60 and 80 at that time. Their usage is shown to the right of the vertical broken line is virtually 100% use of since in 1980 to 60 to 80 years old speaker use between 10 and 14% of the time. The change to G is confirmed as a real change. Okay, next slide. The Milroys or Milroy 1882 and Milroy 1992 are two other linguists who are interested in how change begins. For them, the key lies in network ties. With strong ties, change is slow, but weak ties can lead to rapid change. New forms are adopted by innovators with weak ties to more than one group. Some of these innovations are taken up by core members of the groups. Change result, Milroy and Milroy say that groups linked internally mainly by relatively weak ties are susceptible to innovation and that innovation between groups are generally transmitted by means of weak rather than strong network ties. Example, Trock Coswell, acquaintances rather than kin, close friends or workmates. The point out P17 that their conclusion that change begins therefore in the middle of the social class hierarchy is entirely consistent with above finding. The innovating groups are located centrally in the class structure, characteristic by him as upper working or lower middle class. Okay, next slide. For in British and American society at least, close-knit territorially based kin-oriented networks are located most clearly in the lowest classes, but upper classes networks are in some respects structurally similar. Being relatively dense, Marshall works in 2004 in North Scotland also showed the that the most revealing factor in determining how individuals changed their speech behavior was the group to which they oriented. Those with the most positive orientation to the local rural group resist change. He adds the those who have a higher degree of mental urbanization and or attitude of openness to supra-local norms are at the forefront of change. P. 217. In England, the all regional dialects have been much affected. Local varieties adopted linguistic feature from influential centers, often with women, particularly younger women in the vanguard. The results have been the creation of various non-localist norms interposed between the local vernaculars to which many older and less educated speakers still cling, and standard RP itself gradually atrophying. Okay, thank you. This is for our presentation.